I'm particularly fascinated by this notion of the difference between successors and incumbents. That, like, once you're established as an incumbent and you're in a good groove, like, you're probably gonna stay in a good groove.
Right.
That's the good news. If you're established and you're in a bad groove, you're probably gonna stay in a bad groove. That this notion that when a successor comes in, their actions land differently. You could be a successor, I'm an incumbent. You come in, people are paying more attention to you than they pay attention to me. So I'm really interested. That's a new thing in leadership research. They're like, huh.
Welcome to The Ripple Effect, the podcast that takes you on a journey through the minds of Wharton faculty. I'm your host, Dan Loney, and in each episode, we'll be diving deep into the inspiration behind the groundbreaking research that Wharton professors have conducted and exploring how their findings resonate with the world today. In the corporate world, it's always an interesting period when you're talking about the transition of when one leader decides to step aside and another one decides to take over. Most recently, we heard the announcement that legendary Apple CEO Tim Cook was leaving that role, and then John Ternus, who is the company's senior vice president for hardware engineering, was going to take over that role. But what are the challenges for Ternus and maybe more so other leaders as they take over a new role in leading a company? A new paper looks at those elements specifically. Katherine Klein is a professor of management here at the Wharton School, and she is lead on this new research, which is published in the Journal of Applied Psychology. Katherine, great to talk to you again. How are you?
I'm good. Great to talk with you. Thank you.
So take us, I guess, first behind the scenes in why this topic of looking at how these two leaders kind of compare and contrast was so important.
Great. So I'm an organizational psychologist. And as an organizational psychologist, I'm really interested in how leaders change organizations, how they motivate people. How we believe that better leaders make their organizations better through their leadership style. But it turns out that we have very little research in my field looking at what happens when there's a change at the top, when a new leader takes over, and how employees respond collectively. And that's a topic I've been long interested in, how organizational leaders change, how motivated employees are, and how well the company or organization performs. So I specifically wanted to look at this in the context of succession.
And so for this research, you used public schools as kind of the vehicle to look at that topic.
Yeah. So it turns out that, I think one of the reasons we have so little research on how employees respond to a change at the top, to a successor coming in, is it's really hard to get into a lot of organizations before there's a CEO change and say, what's the culture here? What's the climate? And then track it over time following that change. And, in a rigorous study, you want to study this in a large number of organizations, and you'd actually like to compare organizations that don't have a succession event. And so it's like, oh my God, how can we do this? I like to do large scale research, but like, where on earth can we do this? And at some point, the light bulb went off, and it was like, we can do this in public schools because public schools get new principals in the summer, and school districts know ahead of time when a new leader is coming in. So we can look at schools and survey teachers before and after a principal change, and we can compare them to schools after a principal change. I'm also fascinated by public schools. I believe they're super important in this country. 90% of school children go to public schools. And the vast majority of employers are actually the size of a public school.
How frequently then does the vision of the person coming into the role, is it similar to the person who is leaving the role, or is there a bit of consciousness that they want it to be different than what it was before?
I think a lot of new leaders come in thinking, I've got to change this organization. I've got to raise performance. I really need to make sure employees are highly motivated. I've got to make my mark. And so a lot of them come in with that sense of, I want to make things different. Though interestingly, and we'll get into this in my research, not all of them do. And sometimes they mismatch with where employees are. And that turns out to be really important.
Well, right. And that was one of the things I wanted to talk about is the fact the employee, and I guess in this case with your research, they're talking about the teachers, of what their expectation is and what their vision is of what they want to see come in with the new leader.
Absolutely, and I'm so glad I'm glad you're honing in on this. I'm really glad we studied this because it turned out to be absolutely key. So we asked teachers before the new leaders were coming in, before succession, how much does this school need to change? Is this school performing well, or do we really need changes around here? And it turns out that that's really important. And we have leaders coming in who, when the leaders don't align their leadership with employees' sense of the need for change, you run into problems. When successors come in pushing change, and employees collectively are saying, we're good here. We actually don't need a lot of change,
Right.
then that backfires. It also backfires when employees are feeling like, man, we really need help performing better, and this school needs to change, and the leader's not helping us. So, what we find is that successors really need to read the room. They really need to understand where employees are coming from.
And so then that puts even more focus on the behaviors and the tactics that a successor kind of brings to the table when they're taking over.
Yeah, absolutely. And what's interesting is we measure visionary leadership. Are you inspired by the leader's vision? That has no
Right.
impact, like none. Doesn't change anything for anybody. What matters is what we study is leader coaching. And leaders who are high in coaching are really focused on on improving employee performance. They're giving feedback. They're giving suggestions of how to perform better. They're monitoring and supporting employees like an athletic coach in a lot of ways. Um, and that coaching has ripple effects throughout the organization. Teachers notice what the principal is doing with other teachers. They see that what the leader's doing. Coaching is great when employees feel like we need to improve our performance. We need to change. Coaching backfires and hurts motivation, hurts performance when teachers are saying, like, again, we're good here. We don't need this.
So then what did you see in the research about how these schools changed, adapted when there was a shift of leadership, and whether or not there was that component of working closely with the new leader or not?
Yeah, it's really striking. So, when we study public schools, people care a whole lot about test scores. Like, are
Sure.
kids reading? Are kids up and, are they reading at math level? All parents want it. As a society, we want schools to perform well. And so what we see is what we measure is collective engagement, how focused teachers are on doing their work, how energized they are. And that engagement drives performance change. So the leadership makes a real difference in making strong changes in long-term performance. We see test scores shift, and sometimes they rise and sometimes they fall. And what's key is how successors are coming in and leading is making these changes. I should say also that this is really the first research we have of this kind that shows how successors' leadership behavior really changes how motivated employees are collectively and how organizational performance then changes.
Can you correlate then what you found in this research with what you expect happens in the corporate landscape when you have a switch like this?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the key message, a key message, we have a lot of them in this study, but a key message is successors really need to read the room.
Yeah.
So we sort of assume that, there's a lot of rhetoric in the leadership literature that leaders need to convince employees of the need for change. That's not what we're seeing. In in the schools, we're seeing a lot of times the teachers really believe there's a need for change before the successor comes in, and the successors get it wrong. They don't coach, they don't help, and that's a problem. Successors can also get it wrong when they don't coach and don't support. So I think the same message applies for corporations and businesses of all types. You gotta read the room. You gotta know what employees' appetite for change is before you enter, because 'cause they're thinking about this. They're thinking, "I'm getting a new leader. How's this gonna change us?"
So, and you mentioned about how important schools were to you. I was just thinking as you were saying that, not only does this most likely have an impact on the relationship between the teachers and the leader at the school, but does this have an impact on how a school district thinks about leadership and who they want to have in and how they want to run their operations from school to school on a daily basis?
Absolutely. So coaching and this style of leadership, this kind of sometimes in the leadership literature, it's referred to as in the school literature, it's referred to as instructional leadership.
Right.
And it's instructional leadership, this kind of hands-on coaching is not a universal good thing.
Right.
Like, it can really backfire. The other thing that's really striking about our results is that successors' leadership behavior, successors' coaching really matters and changes things. When we compare that to incumbents, people, leaders who haven't changed, who've been there all along, their coaching doesn't have much impact. And so, what it's saying to us is when you enter an organization as a leader, when you start as a successor, your actions have a whole lot of impact. People are really paying attention to how you lead,
Right.
and you can make things, you have a window of opportunity, you can make things better, you can make things worse. When you're established as an ongoing leader, it's hard to move the needle with your coaching, with how you interact with employees. So bringing it back to your question of how should school districts be thinking about it, when a school is really stagnant and you're having a hard time, the existing leader is having a hard time motivating people, getting improvements in test scores and performance, it's time to think maybe we really need a successor to do this.
Right.
Maybe an incumbent just can't move the needle.
So I mentioned the change at the top coming later this year with Apple. Just, this is such a brand new element to the story, and
Of course.
ironic that we're talking about this as your research is coming out. What do you think are some of the things that you would be looking at as this change takes place at one of the most well-known companies in the world?
Right. Well, it is interesting that it's happening right as this research is coming out. I think that John Turnus he's an insider, right?
Yep.
He's been there for a long time. He knows this organization. My guess is he doesn't need a lot of help reading the room. He understands what the organization's challenges are, what Apple's challenges are, and he understands Apple's employees' appetite for change. So I think he's likely to do quite well along the vector and the dynamics I've been describing. When we talk about reading the room and the importance of understanding employees' appetite for change, it's also striking that Tim Cook is staying on as executive chair. It's a signal that, like, things are not gonna change, probably not gonna change radically around here. My intuition is that's probably where employees are, that it'll probably be slow and steady change, and that's probably appropriate for the culture and the performance of Apple. So, I think this is a good call. And in general, we know insiders do better. I think
Yeah.
one of the reasons insiders do better is they do understand the organization.
Is there, off of this research, is there a follow-up that you want to look at next off of this?
Oh, we would love to. We would love to. I would tell you this was a monumental effort to study this many
Yeah,
schools
right.
over, hundreds, more than 100 schools over time, 7 of the largest school districts in the country. But there's a lot we'd like to know. I'm particularly fascinated by this notion of the difference between successors and incumbents. That, like, once you're established as an incumbent and you're in a good groove, like, you're probably going to stay in a good groove.
Right.
That's the good news. If you're established and think you're in a bad groove, you're probably gonna stay in a bad groove. And, that this notion that when a successor comes in, their actions land differently. You could be a successor, I'm an incumbent. You come in, people are paying more attention to you than they pay attention to me. So I'm really interested. That's a new thing in leadership research. They're like, "Huh, this may land differently if you're a successor."
So as you're saying this, and this will be my last question, I promise. But it was an interesting element that you bring up, because when you're talking about the framework of a school district, I would think in many cases the incumbent could be somebody who was in another school as the leader and is making that shift and probably already has set a framework of how they run. And teachers, obviously, in other schools would know, what to expect, or what the next step would be for their school with this person coming on board.
Yes, I think you meant the successor. So,
Sorry, yeah,
successors will often transfer. Yeah, I think they know that, they know something, right? They know something, but they haven't experienced the successor, and they're still all eyes are looking like, "Well, what is this new leader gonna need for us?" Succession creates a lot of uncertainty,
yeah,
we're getting a new boss, how are things gonna change? So, even if we know something, they're paying attention. People are gonna be paying attention to John Turnus. They're gonna be like, "Okay, he's probably not too radical.
yeah.
Okay, we know the guy, we like the guy, he has a very positive reputation." They're still gonna be paying a lot of attention to what he does.
Katherine, always great to talk. Thanks very much for your time today.
Great to talk with you. Thank you so much. Take care.
Thank you. Katherine Klein, who is a professor of management here at the Wharton School. Thank you for listening to The Ripple Effect. We hope you found this episode informative and engaging. Don't forget to subscribe and leave us a review so that we can continue to bring you the best insight from the Wharton School.